the case study
Okay.
that I will present to you. So, so let me just start with some general kind of introduction about East Asian mapping. So we have in literary Chinese, which is the written language that in pre-modern times connected all of East Asia, including Japan, Korea, and of course China. In the written language of literary Chinese, what we're thinking of as map is this character tu or do or zo in Korean and Japanese respectively. So it's a very interesting idea, concept, and of course, word. And it could serve as a noun or as a verb. And as a noun, it could mean a range of things, including pictures, diagrams, charts, and tables, as we are familiar with. And as a verb, it's also really interesting. And it means kind of this process of planning, anticipating, giving thoughts to, or contending for something. So you can tool a plan, an invasion, for example, military strategy, and of course, in literary Chinese, "tu" as a word can also form compound words when you combine it with, for example, 地图 or terrestrial diagram, which means terrestrial diagram or pictorial diagram, complete diagram or a complete map, et cetera, et cetera. So it's a very versatile polysemic word. And just to kind of get us thinking about what it is that we're talking about when we talk about maps. The historian of cartography, Cordell Yi, in his one of his essays on Chinese mapping, um, called this idea of tool, this concept of tool, a representational complex. And I'm giving this diagram, my own diagram, to give you a sense of what he meant. So this idea of map or tool connects with adjacent, genres like painting, diagram, but also text, literature, and illustration and chart. So as we go forward, what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you three examples of how painting, map, and chart, et cetera, all these polysemic representations of tool can work together in the East Asian cultural context. So I will start with showing you a historical atlas that is quite text dominant. You'll see in a minute. And then I'm going to move forward to this pilgrimage by a Buddhist monk and show you how a travel log can become a map and vice versa. And then I'm going to delve into the case study that I promised well, showing you a little bit of a preview of the Yellow River as represented on this really long scroll. Um, so let's start with a historical atlas. So what you're seeing here, not in great resolution, but I think you can get an idea. This is actually an 11th century historical atlas. And for those of you who might be less familiar with the timeline of Chinese history, this is the beginning of, well, actually, this is the late Song, well, the late Northern Song dynasty. And what you can see here, of course, is that this is a historical atlas that is really crowded with writing. I will zoom in now to the northeast side of the northeast portion of this map. And you can see, first of all, that there is a colophon that begins with the right side of the map that is kind of an introduction to this particular rendition of the Chinese Empire in basically in the centuries prior to when this historical atlas was made. And you can see that it's, again, very dense with text, toponyms. If you can see at the very top, there is a representation of the Great Wall.
Mm.
shown by these tooth-like watchtowers on this map. And so what matters more on this map is that the list of the place names rather than how where they specifically fall. So this is an example of what I call a spatialized toponym chart. And what's important for this historical atlas to convey is some kind of large scale um, uh, layout of what is called the 10 commanderies, the 10 administrative units during the Tang Dynasty prior to the Song Dynasty. But within the commandery borders, the place names are basically lists. So it's an interesting way to look at how maps encompass a list, a textual list. And the second point I wanted to make, like I said, is that Chinese maps and also East Asian maps in general can capture more than play spatial relationships, but it captures cosmography and also travel chronicle in this case. So in this case, we can go to Japan. And again, this is a pretty early map. It's from the 14th century. It's called the Map of the Five Regions of India. And it's in this wonderful temple, Horyuji, in Nara, Japan. And it's a very rare and exceptional, spectacular map done on paper with ink and colors. I will zoom in a little bit. Um, well, actually, no, I will not zoom in. I'll show you a diagram just because it's very difficult to see on this slide. On the left is a diagram of what this map encompasses. And as you can see, this is an oval-shaped land, and it represents the Buddhist cosmology, and in which India is at the center. And there's this kind of like a whirlpool like lake on the upper center. And what it is a sacred lake that gives birth to four rivers flowing in four directions. And you can see there's North India, Central India, South India, East and West India in the kind of the lower part of the egg-shaped continent. And very interestingly, if you look closely, China is represented on the edge, on the top edge, right side of this egg-shaped continent. And Japan, incidentally, is entirely outside of this map. I mean, but I'm sorry, it's outside of the continent, but it's not outside of the map. So this is a cosmography of the Buddhist layout, Buddhist cosmology, with Japan hanging at the margins. But this is not all. Actually, I'll show you a slightly more focused version of this. There are other mythical, we can call mythical, roughly, place names like the Eastern women's country. I believe, uh, under sort of to the south of this continent, we have Sri Lanka or Ceylon. And then we have a kind of features, geographical features that are part cosmography and part cartography. So, but what's more is that this is in fact also a travel
Linda,
chronologue.
can I ask a question?
Yes.
Excuse me. I'm, of course, I guess not surprisingly fascinated by the Eastern and Western women's country. What can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, it's they're very likely additions from an earlier Chinese um, text on kind of ancient lands and sort of land beyond the pale. So, yeah, but here the main representation is of the Buddhist um,
Okay.
cosmography. Um,
Excuse me, Linda. How would a map like this end up in Japan, since Japan doesn't seem to
oh,
be
it
very
is a
far?
Japanese map.
Interesting.
Yeah, so I will get to that in a second, but it is absolutely a Japanese map. And if once I zoom into it, you'll see a little bit better why that is. And again, that's a wonderful question because it looks, there are Chinese characters on there. It has, if not it's a India-centric map where Japan does not seem to have a central, a very important place for it. But of course, this discourse of of cosmography and travel does not belong, it did not belong to China alone. And you will see that Japan very, very much was interested in the journey of this monk, which I'll now get to. So
Sorry, sorry, we have one more question.
yes,
If that's all,
absolutely.
I hope that's all right. We're a
No,
curious
please.
group here.
It's great.
On the map, I think I saw a Mount Malaya at the bottom. Are those like little mountain areas supposed to represent Southeast Asia, or is that supposed to be
Yes,
part of South Asia?
absolutely. Absolutely. And that's also one of the reasons that it's such a wonderful map and such rich map to think about in that it does represent um, the world's very much very far from from Japan and very far from China. But of course, travel was possible to Southeast Asia at this time. Maybe not directly from Japan, but certainly from continental East Asia. Is that sorry, Tom,
Yeah,
I
thank
can
you.
see people
Yeah,
are like,
yes. Yeah, that's great. Thank you.
okay, so just moving on to the monk. So this monk Xuanzang, who is actually being featured in this map, even though that we have not quite gotten to that part yet. So he was a Tang Dynasty Buddhist monk from central China. And of course, this was still relatively early in the history of Buddhist scripture being translated fully into the Chinese language, even though it seems like Buddhism has entered China centuries ago. So his major feat and his major accomplishment was to actually to travel from the Tang Dynasty capital of Chang'an, what is present-day Xi'an, in the north, to India and return with scrolls of Indian scripture, which was very important to this to really the for Buddhism in China. And also, during his travels, he had taken notes and he documented his travels in what is called the records of the Western regions. And again, this was a phenomenal accomplishment, and this was very much a new thing for the Chinese public, for the Chinese royalty, for the Chinese Buddhist practitioners. And so it's really the combination of his making Buddhist scripture sutras available to the East Asian public, and also kind of showing the public a little bit more about what he saw and experienced. So this map, um, this pretty large map, encompasses all of those things. And if we zoom in, so I just chose one square, one part of this map to zoom in on. And again, it's very difficult to see if we show the map in its entirety. If we zoom way in, what you'll see are these cartouches with place names. We have a road in brown. Um, and we have some geological features like peaks um, uh, and bodies of water. And then we have this red line that essentially connects these place names in the whitish rectangles that represents the itinerary of Xuanzang as he traveled from China to India and recorded his journey. And if for those of you who can read Chinese, you might be able to notice that these place names are um, are very unusual. There are basically transliterations of other languages. Um, and so they're very unruly. If you're familiar with Chinese place names, they don't look anything really intelligible to the modern reader, to or even just maybe not so modern reader.
Can we pause for a second? I want to ask
Sure.
their Chinese people who anybody speak anybody know Chinese a little bit?
Anybody read Chinese?
Do you recognize any of these characters?
I mean, I can read them, but it just doesn't make sense. The last character means country, the previous character is basically just random combination of.
Yeah. So they're transliterations. They're not
Exactly.
actual. Uh,
Exactly.
yeah.
So, which is why they're so long and they're kind of cumbersome. Uh,
Uh-huh.
and I can't really tell you what they are. I mean, so the point is it's kind of a polyglot map also with it really shows the kind of the really the foreign nature of well his travels, but also the documentation of that. So there's a lot more I can say about this map. Of course, it's a wonderful map, but I'm using this to really to prove this characteristic of East Asian map in that it could be so many things simultaneously. In this case, cosmography, travel journey, but also if you compiled all the text on this map, you could basically recreate the travel log itself. It's like you can reassemble the travel log from the writing on this map, should you want to. So it's kind of and also a way for Japanese Buddhist practitioners to practice, to kind of follow along on Xuanzang's journey and to experience that pilgrimage to India without leaving Japan.
And that's 7 centuries after he actually took his trip or
Uh,
something like that.
Well, this was a 14th century map, but the practice might have started earlier. So, but yes, he did this in the 7th century. So, yeah.
Okay.
So, if it's okay,
Amazing.
should I move on, or I
Yeah,
can
yeah, yeah, sure.
absolutely come back to this and come back
No,
to this image
great.
and all of those good things. So the third point I wanted to make is that maps and paintings are often not are inseparable in the East Asian context. And here I use the example of the Yellow River on a scroll. And here we go to the Met. I understand that you guys went to New York for
Ah,
a field trip recently, but in the Met there is this scroll from I think the 18th century here of an unidentified artist who is was trying to capture the Yellow River in its full splendor. And so this is a very long scroll. So just to give you a sense of how long it is, I have a picture with a person walking in front of it. And at the time I took this picture, the scroll was displayed, but I don't think that it was displayed in its entirety. This is a 12 meter long scroll when you unfold it. And of course, it goes from the right to the left. And it begins, it sort of follow the Yellow River. But I want to show you here again, zooming in on a detail, in this wonderful way that this map is two things at once. So on the top, at the top half, what you see is this top-down view of the Yellow River with the waves represented. The color of the Yellow River with all its sediments is, of course, yellowish. And you see its meanders, its turns, which it's famous for. Um, and then in between, or slightly below it, you see this kind of a walled town or smallish town with its buildings um, and surrounded by outside of the walls by some trees and the countryside. And then below that, we have what is kind of classical landscape painting representation in Chinese painting of mountains viewed from the side. So we have this green, blue coloration of these mountains, and they're represented completely from a different perspective. And so, so this is a scroll that captures the Yellow River in its journey from the western part of China into the Eastern Sea, and in so doing, it's kind of it's a map, and then it's a landscape painting with gradations in between. And so it's also a really wonderful and rich way of thinking about what a map can do. So if you allow me to move on to this more specific question, this case study of how the Yellow River, how does the Yellow River begin? That is a mapping of it, but also more than a mapping of it. So, so what I just showed you is a scroll from the 18th century. But of course, the question began much, much earlier. So just some quick background about the Yellow River. Um, Today, um, we know that it begins at in this mountain range on the Tibetan Plateau, which gives birth to many rivers, not just the Yellow River. And we can locate that area with satellite imaging and modern technology. But it's interesting to think that the details about the headwater of the Yellow River was actually still being debated very late, actually late into the 20th century, with repeated modern surveys in the 80s, beginning in the late 80s, but kind of continuing on. And these modern scientific surveys still had degrees of certainty about exactly where the source is, and if it's one lake, two lakes, et cetera, et cetera. But moving back in time, thinking about the Yellow River as a specific problem, what's interesting about it is that while serving as one of these iconic places or kind of cosmographic ideas for China, it has mostly the Yellow River begins outside of China's imperial border, and the multiple empires of China in all of its succession are mostly in the northeastern. It began as the northeastern part of China, central China. Of course, this changed constantly through the centuries, but this was something that's not easy for a Chinese cartographer, map maker, historian to access. It's also not subject to human modification and control, unlike the lower uh, uh, parts of the river. And so this is has always been more of an epistemological rather than hydrological problem for again, historians and philosophers of China. And it has become kind of an interpretive space into which different kinds of mythopoetic discourse, cosmography has competed for coherence, shall we say. And so what we see, if we really delve deep into this long history of the river's source, we can start with very early, and by early I mean pre-imperial texts, mythopoetic texts that posits a certain mythical mountain as the source of the river, the Yellow River. And moving on into later era in the early medieval period, when we start to get geographical texts about the different rivers of China, including the Yellow River. And then it's much later, really starting in the 12th century onward, that we have extant maps that we can refer to that actually show the source of the Yellow River in different degrees of detail, before we have the modern scientific surveys that gives us, things that we know today about, everything I just said about the Tibetan Plateau, et cetera, et cetera. So in this long history, which is rich and really, really interesting, and I don't have enough time to talk about it, and I don't know everything about it either, I want to just kind of bring us to the 13th century because something really interesting happened in the 13th century, which is with a new Mongol empire. That is to say, for those of you who are less familiar with Chinese history, the Mongols took over China and ruled as the Yuan dynasty from 1271 to 1368. And with this beginning of the Mongol dynasty, there was a new imperial expedition, an actual expedition to the river source. And everything I just told you is not an easy feat. But the new Mongol regime managed it. And so under Kublai Khan, two brothers of Jurgen descent, so they're not Chinese, obviously, they're not Chinese officials. They were sent to identify, to explore the Yellow River source. And what they did was quite remarkable. They identified this lake, which I'm translating as Constellation Lake, but there are other translations. They identified this lake called Xingqiuhai as the source of the Yellow River, very positively identified this. And they documented the travel distances between the key features of the upper reaches of the river. Again, no mean feat because the Chinese themselves were not able to do this, even in the preceding centuries. And also, they explained this relationship of this lake to the mythical Mount Kunlun that has always been for the long history prior to this exploration. Mount Kunlun was believed to be kind of the center of the world, and this mountain where the Yellow River began. So all of these things they did, but what we have access to is actually quite more complicated. And this is where the historian of cartography kind of has to get into some of the nitty-gritties. So of course, this was a documented, we know that this happened through Chinese records, but no actual record from this 1280 expedition survived. And there are lots of reasons for it. There's lots of good reasons for it. But the earliest textual record we have is actually by a Chinese official about 50 years later, um, published in one of his personal kind of records of things that he knew. And that itself did not include a map. But for an actual map of the expedition, we have to wait for about 100 years later, in which another of Chinese official recorded this map that kind of encompasses the expedition. So what we're seeing again is a, a retrospective map of this expedition, but it's still quite remarkable. So again, we're looking at the 14th century map of the 13th century expedition. And what you'll notice is actually it's oriented with south on top. And it's a woodcut print map, so we don't have colors, but we have these cartouches of place names, and we have representations of the river and of mountains. So if you want to kind of look at this, the Yellow River is going to start on the right side and it's going to flow to the left. And again, it's also very interesting that it has south at top, and this actually reflects the influence of Arabic mapping on the Mongol mapping, although there's not a lot of Mongol maps that survive, so it's not definitive, but it certainly has that very, very clear influence. And so in the the red square, I've isolated the Constellation Lake that the two brothers, the Jurgen brothers on this Mongol expedition identified as Constellation Lake at the beginning of the Yellow River. And in the green circle, I have Kunlun Mountain, which is the mythical, long held to be sacred mountain that supposedly gave rise to the Yellow River in previous texts. And what we have are, again, textual descriptions of the constellation lake. And the reason it's called Constellation Lake, really interesting, is that it covers 70 to 80 square li. It's a large area. But what's interesting is it features over 100 springs and pools that are muddy. And it's described by the Chinese official 100 years later. And it says, when viewed from a high mountain nearby, they sparkle like arrayed stars, hence the constellation term. And um, from this, so what's interesting for us is that from this description in the 1430s black and white, and again, I won't have time to go into it, but if you look closely at the place names, they are also polylingual. There are also transliterations of Mongol and Tibetan names, with the exception of Xingxiuhai, which is the constellation lake. So what I want to show you is that from this map, from this Mongol expedition, this explosion of cartographic representation happened in the subsequent centuries that are also trying to capture the very kind of complicated and also layered existence of the headwater of the Yellow River. So what I'm going to show you very quickly is this dizzying variety of responses in the subsequent Ming Dynasty, which spanned over about 300 years, and was a Chinese dynasty. So the Mongols did not continue to rule China, and so the China returned to a Chinese emperor. And so what was really wonderful is that we have these, what I'm just isolating as three different models, what I'm calling the necklace model, the gourd model, and the hydra model, depending on how the shape of the headwater is represented. And I will show you what each of these variations can tell us about mapping in general. So this is a really wonderful map. I wish we had more time to go into it, but I can only just kind of show you a flyby image. It's a really early map of the Chinese Empire from the early Ming. And it's not very accessible. This is why I don't have a very good image of it. But in the middle of this 2-3 meter um, um, map, we have the source of the Yellow River, and we have to zoom in very drastically to see what it is. What you see is a snowy mountain, a river with many branches. So this is, we're going from right to left and going up river. And then we come to two kind of lakes, two lobes that are lakes. And then we come to the actual source. So again, I'm showing you the snow-capped mountain and the ultimate source of the river on the lower left. And if we zoom in on the lower left, on the source, what you see is what I call the necklace model, where it's strings of pearls arrayed in a circular manner. So moving on to another model, what I'm calling the gourd model, we go to a later map, also in the Ming Dynasty, that's right now in Spain, in an archive in Spain, and it's a printed map. So previously I showed you a painted map on silk. This is a printed map on paper. And the Yellow River is colored in a kind of a yellow-brown color. And again, now that you're seeing the pattern here, in the left side, in the western edge of the empire, we have the source of the Yellow River, and it is a gourd shape. So the two place names, they render the source of the Yellow River, and again, Constellation Lake. And on the top lobe, we see these wave patterns. And on the lower half of the gourd, we see these small circles that represent these small pools as noted in the Mongol expedition. The third model that I will show you is what I call the hydro model. And for this, you will have to go to Denver,
Cool.
Denver Art Museum. There is this, so here we have a Japanese map from the Edo, the Tokugawa Gawa period. This is 17th century. This is a paper map with pigments, various pigments. And here you see two of the many conservators when the map was being restored in the back room. It's a really privileged view. But the map, I believe it should be on display. It's also a spectacular map. That is I believe it's like 2 meters by 2 meters, something on that order. And so if we go to the western side of this map, again, this is a Japanese map. This is a Japanese map that retrospectively captures the Ming Dynasty after the Ming Dynasty is no longer in existence. And we
Linda,
want to zoom in
Linda,
the source.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I just want to give you a heads up that we are going to have to stop at the top of the hour here
Got
in
it.
5 minutes or
Okay.
so.
I'm getting
Five
to the
minutes.
end. Yeah. So
Okay.
if we zoom into the ultimate source of the Yellow River, this is what I call the Hydra model. It has a central body of water that has these lobes growing out of it, which is a distinct shape from what I just showed you in the previous models. So what can we learn from these variations? If we compare these two maps in that are less colorful and less spectacular in encyclopedia and gazetteers, we can see ways that the necklace model, for example, resonates with other kinds of texts. This is a gazetteer about also about the Yellow River, and we see that the Constellation Lake is shown as these braids of, again, like pearls, strings of pearls, but arrayed in a different way. And if we kind of compare them, we see that what they have in common are this like pearl on a string kind of shape. And I wanted to show you this visual vocabulary. It comes from star maps, and I'm going back earlier in time to a 7th century star map in a manuscript. And what these images have in common is that they both make visual elaborations on the name constellation. And um, just to give us time, I'm going to skip the gourd model. Um, and I just want to take a step back and ask, what can all of these variations tell us about mapping? So if we step back, what we find is that even by the late Ming Dynasty, well after the expedition has happened, there was actually no consensus on these maps as to how the Yellow River begins. And so what we see here is not a case where earlier elaborations that are cosmological or geographical, with the input of new expeditions, become the new and more correct geographical knowledge. We do not have this teleological kind of change. What we do see is something much more interesting, is that the earlier elaborations of whether it's textual, cosmological, they go through this iterative contingent process of knowledge making. And then with the combination of input of new geographical knowledge, they sometimes go back to earlier models and they try to make sense of earlier models without completely letting go of it. And this is why, as late as the 17th, 18th century, we still see Mount Kunlun, the mythical mountain, sometimes represented on maps that depict the source of the Yellow River. And so it deserves a particular kind of attention. And it kind of makes us think about what maps do. And Francesca Bray the historian of science, has this really wonderful definition of tool that I really love to kind of end with, which she says it's a graphic image or layout with encoded knowledge that like kind of work as templates for action. And so this is how I want to leave you thinking about the Yellow River source, but also about East Asian mapping practices in general. And I'm sorry, I didn't realize that we had a little bit less time than I had planned for, but I'm I'm open to quick questions, or you could also email me anytime with questions if you want to, uh, want recommended readings, or whatever your interest might take you. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Linda. I really appreciate it. I think in the interest of time, I'm going to solicit questions from our group and then send them your way.
Great,
So we'll circle up on that tomorrow. But thank you
great.
again so much for your presentation. I really appreciate it.
Sure. I really enjoy it. Thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the class.
Thank you. Help yourself if you want a snack. I brought those in for all of you guys if you want one. And then we're going to meet at Special Collections. We're going to see maps of Williamstown.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you, Tom. Very interesting as
Gordon.
always. Appreciate
Thank
it.
you. See you.